I've got to admit, I'm a bit nervous about being here at a data summit for a few reasons, actually. So firstly, as my team will attest, I'm not the most technical person. I might even be on the sort of laggard end of the earlier presentations. Secondly, I'm talking about cash, which is what, 2,000, 3,000, 6,000 years old? Like, it's not exactly a new technology when we're talking about AI and all that exciting things. And I'm representing Link, which I like to describe as a 1980s version of fintech. We are 40 years old this year. And as Gina said, for 40 years, we've been doing reliable payments, whatever bank you bank with, whatever ATM you go to across the whole UK. But really, that's 80s technology. It just means that that should work every time you do it. Works really well. But then this story is about how we've transformed from just doing that into supporting financial inclusion across the UK. So we're going to talk about how data's been right at the heart of that journey. And throughout, I'm absolutely thrilled that Jamie's on the stage with me because CACI have been supporting us for the last 10 years or so on that journey and providing us with the data that runs all the way through it. So we perhaps should have had a different title, from 80s fintech to community supporting access to cash, financial inclusion, and hopefully real impact as well. So throughout explaining that journey, I'm probably going to lean on Jamie a fair bit.
Absolutely.
So you've had the introduction to Link. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about cash. So a little bit of audience participation, I'm afraid. So what I'd like you to do is, if you have ever used cash, can you please stick up your hands? So guessing that is going to be 100% of the room. Okay,
So
Jamie is going to
fine.
be in charge of stats. So keep your hands up, please.
Hold them there while I count them all.
But can you please put your hands down if you haven't used cash in 2025? Testing your memories a bit, but there'll be some people in the room, I reckon. Okay. And then keep your minds thinking back. And if you haven't used cash since, say, Easter, so a couple of months, if you've not used cash in a couple of months, put your hands down. Okay. We're losing some people, but not everyone.
A lot of hands up.
Still a lot of hands up. This is interesting. So how about since the start of May? We're at the start of June now, so just over a month. If you've not used cash in about a month, where are we? We're losing quite a lot of hands now. One hand just went back up. Interesting. So what are we at, Jamie? What do you think? 50, 60%?
About half. It's about half, isn't it?
50%. So last 2 weeks. If you've used cash in the last 2 weeks, keep your hands up. We're down to what, 40% maybe, Jamie?
Yeah.
You agree? Lovely. Okay, so you can all put your hands down now. Thank you for playing along. The reason I've asked that question is we've done some work about who uses cash. And my hunch, I was chatting to Jamie about this before, was that people who come to data conferences in central London probably aren't at the core of it. And that you proved me right. But actually, there's more hands up than I was expecting when we were chatting about it before.
Absolutely.
So what's going on? Cash withdrawals are massively down. And it is being driven by those people putting their hands down, choosing to use other payments. It's absolutely fine. Those other payment systems work perfectly well for most people most of the time. But the people who are still holding on to cash are overwhelmingly likely to be deprived, overwhelmingly likely to be digitally excluded, overwhelmingly likely to be old as well. FCA have recently done some work really backing that up, and they said if you're a heavy cash user, so someone who relies on it all of the time or most of the time, your household income is likely to be £15,000 or less. And that's 2.6 million people that the FCA reckon use cash for either all their purchases, including bills, or most of them. So what we're seeing is a huge drop in cash withdrawals across our network. That drop since COVID is the biggest one, but it's still on a downward trend. That is being driven by the people in this room who have options to pay in different ways. We think it's only going in one direction as well, only going down because those options are getting better, because they're convenient, we speak to colleagues at Link. We're in charge of the cash network. We all use digital payments a lot. So that's the way it's going. And it's really critical that we look after the most vulnerable, most excluded people who still need it to buy the basics. So that's a challenge, I think, at the heart of this journey from 80s fintech through to today. And that is because the ATM network is, frankly, it's a commercial marketplace in its own right. So Link doesn't own or operate any ATMs. You've seen our logo on the ATMs, but commercial operators and banks operate the ATMs. And if you're a commercial operator, so say Jaime was running an ATM network of his own and connected to Link, he would get paid every time someone uses his machine. So as people withdraw cash less, as we use it less, he gets paid less money. So as a result, we are seeing the number of ATMs decline. So far, no surprises. But how do we fix that for people who are vulnerable? Because if we just let the marketplace do its thing, then the most remote places would lose their machine because you've got to drive a diesel van into the middle of Scotland and it costs you more money. The most deprived areas where perhaps you need a bit more security, perhaps it's a bit more complicated to put into a small shop, lose their machines. So we've been working on this for a number of years. And Jaime, I think the same is true of bank branches as well.
That's right. It's not just cash, it's banking as well. We're seeing exactly the same sorts of thing. We've lost about 2/3 of branches over the last 10 years. That's almost 6,500 branch closures, as banks have had to juggle falling demand, rising costs, as well as the individual needs of their customers. And as Nick says, it's impacted those most that rely on that cash or face-to-face banking. So, as the FCA report says, it's the financially vulnerable, it's the digitally excluded, it's the elderly, it's the low income, and of course, not to forget as well, it's small businesses too who really need that face-to-face branch.
Absolutely. So Gina mentioned that I'd come across from the House of Commons. There is a debate in the House of Commons tomorrow, which is all about bank branches and access to cash. So I'm in there talking to MPs because this is a massive topic. People realise that this has a real impact on cash users' lives. And I spend my time making sure that people in Westminster who probably all pay with digital payments understand that and translate it into policy, which, to be fair, they've done a good job of so far, but we're explaining exactly how we do that. And I think at the heart of all of it, unsurprisingly for this data conference, is data. So we've been on this journey. When we started it, Link had a rudimentary view of 50,000 ATMs connected to the network. We knew enough so that if you went there, your transaction would happen and that'd be fine. And we've been on this journey building more and more and more data to make sure that we can actually impact on communities and people using cash. So I'm going to run through some of the things that we have done to manage this challenge. And Jaime is going to fill in some of the technical detail of how...
chip in with some of the data bits, yeah.
Yes, because I can do the top level stuff and Jaime can give you actual insight. So first of all, first big thing we did in 2018 was protect the last ATM in town. Now that's an easy statement to make, but really how we did it was protecting any ATM and giving it more money. So Jamie's ATM network all of a sudden makes more money if he's running the last ATM in town. And to do that, we need something actually sensible and actually that fits all our members, fits all the banks, make sure the bank's happy, make sure that the politicians are happy as well. So Jaime, how did we do that?
Well, you can't do that. You can't work out how far a kilometre is if you don't actually know where the ATMs are. And that sounds really obvious and basic. But if your coordinates for those ATMs aren't very accurate, you're not going to be able to do that very well or very correctly. So what we're doing with Link is taking a feed of their ATM addresses on a monthly basis. Anything that is either new, updated, we're feeding in. We're using matching software, we're using points of interest data, we're using address files from the likes of Royal Mail, Ordnance Survey. We're bringing all those data points together, and by doing that, we're able to put those ATMs and those coordinates and be able to put them on a map to where they actually are, normally to within about 5 or 10 meters. And that's really important for doing those vulnerability calculations, that 1 kilometer calculation.
And you would not believe how much these ATMs move about. For something that's quite big and stuck in the ground, you would not believe what our 29 different members do with their data. And on the ground, my favourite story is a machine that wasn't operational that we got lots of questions about, and it turned out it was hidden behind a fridge because the storekeeper didn't want it on. And we got all sorts of questions, and Jamie had to figure out what was going on. So first step in the data journey was figuring out where those ATMs were and what they're doing as the network thins out. Second step, we said, well, let's guarantee free cash access for every high street in the country. Challenge there is, if I asked everyone in this room to come up with a definition of every high street in the country, we'd get 100 different answers. So again, Jamie, what did we do to actually answer that question?
Well, how on earth do you define a high street and do it in such a way that is simple, easy to understand, without going into loads of detail? So we came up with this idea of something we called a retail centre, which was anywhere with 5 or more retailers. Without going into all the detail of the points of interest data underneath or any of the spatial clustering, it's a nice, easy definition to be able to share and explain to people. And we're going to talk about some of the wide range of stakeholders that get involved. It's really important to have that nice, simple definition.
So we had the list of high streets. I think there's 7,000.
There's just shy under 8,000 of these retail centres across the UK. And then the important thing is that list of centres and the definition behind it, we've shared that across the industry so that everybody has that common understanding, that common set of data points that they can then use across the industry, across the board, to help understand some of the decisions that are being made around access to cash.
So that's the work we've done, and that probably takes us up to 2021 or so. And the next step in the journey was there was more and more pressure coming over the bank branch closures that Jamie was talking about. Now, obviously, we do not have the same data about the bank branches in the country, but because we developed this language, because we developed this platform of talking about high street access, we got given a job of assessing thousands of locations whenever a bank branch closes, whenever an ATM closes, whenever a post office closes. And I'll talk about how that's developed a little bit. But essentially, we are going into more and more detail. And on these few steps, we've gone from looking at the ATM network to looking at high streets and shops. And now we're on a situation where we're looking at all those things, as well as bank branches, as well as the people who live nearby and the businesses and what they need on a broader level. So, Jamie, talk to us a bit about how we do that data-wise.
So we've got our 8,000 high streets, and what we're doing, we're bringing together a lot of different relevant data points on each of those locations. So that's, for example, the numbers of retailers that are there, it's the local population, it's the age of that population. And when we're talking about reliance on cash and face-to-face banking, it's metrics that indicate areas of high financial vulnerability or digital exclusion. It's bringing all that together whilst at the same time removing as much complexity as possible. And that's really, really important. So, for example, when we talk about population, rather than use complex catchments or complicated drive times, all we're doing is drawing a circle around a town and then counting up the people that's in it, keeping it nice and simple, and then putting it all in one tool. And what that allows us to do is to share that data across, not just with Link, but with the member banks, with the FCA, and with the organisations that are then running the banking hubs themselves. So that's Cash Access UK and the Post Office. So everybody can see the same data, replicate effectively the same decisions that Link are going through in the process, and it's that's driving through the consistency, and they're all getting the same data and the same updates at the same time.
And the final part of the jigsaw, I think, and this is a really important piece of work for us, is a final overlay of looking at some of the most deprived areas of the country. So we take spatial data, we look at postcode data of where everyone lives, we look at those high streets, we look at the networks, and we guarantee cash access on another layer as well. So that's bringing together what bits of data, Jamie?
Again, it's making sure those ATMs are in the right place, and it's like joining up the dots really between the cash supply and the vulnerable areas. So if Link can understand where the ATMs actually are, the areas they're in, and then understand some of the metrics around vulnerability for those areas, they can make sure that they're commissioning the right cash solutions in the right places and make sure they're focusing their funding on those deprived areas.
And I would just add that we have a very manual safeguard on all this. So we have all the data from CACI, which is generally pretty much spot on, which you consider how much we're looking at is great. But we also invite communities to come to us and say, hey, you've got this wrong, or hey, I've got a problem. And we will take their point of view, put it through the system and test it. And if they are right, we will go and fix it. So we have that sort of manual safeguard as well, which I think is really important. And it's particularly important given how much oversight we have on this. So we've mentioned being in Westminster already. There are 650 MPs in Westminster. Every single one of them cares about this to some extent because it's their most vulnerable constituents. It is their businesses on the high streets. It is very visible and tangible. So we have got 650 very committed stakeholders there. And that's why in 2023, the Treasury legislated a framework for all this work, because we've gone through a journey of starting this voluntary and then getting regulated by the PSR on that 1 kilometre last ATM in town. And then the Treasury came along and said, we need to do more about this. And they gave the FCA powers to set regulations and say, you've got to do this to a really good standard, which they've done and which we now are designated to apply. But the key point in all this is that there's this platform of everyone speaking the same language. And that's powered by this data, powered by the fact that CACI share it across the whole industry, essentially, so that we're not coming up with 1,000 different answers for the 8,000 different locations. And touch wood, it is going well so far. So what we thought we would do is give you a little case study of how this works. This all sounds quite theoretical so far. So is there anyone in the room from Teesside? Quick challenge.
Too far to come.
There we go. Right. Well, I can say what I want about this place then. So we're gonna cover Redcar, which is in Teesside. So I guess the reason for doing this is just try and bring it to life a little bit. So Jamie's going to talk about some of the data that we cover for a place like Redcar, why we do it, what we're doing, and I'll cover then what we then do with it and how we come up with an answer, which hopefully bring it to life a little bit. So Jamie, talk us through CACI's data.
So yeah, Redcar, it's a lovely little coastal town up in the northeast, quite close to Middlesbrough. And it used to have 7 banks. Now, when Santander closes later this year, that will leave it with just 2 branches left, a Halifax and a Nationwide. So seven down to 2. Now, when Santander announced they were closing their Redcar branch, that triggered one of these cash access assessments. And so Nick and his team jumped into action. And the first step is to look at the data and look at the tool and look at some of the data points behind Redcar. So, what's that data telling us? Well, it's telling us that actually Redcar is a fairly large town. It's got 176 cafes, shops, pubs, hairdressers, those sorts of organisations that are likely to be handling cash on a regular basis. And it's also telling us that within 3 miles, we've got 40,000 people living there. But actually, almost more importantly, almost a quarter of those people are aged 65 and over, which is massively above the UK average. In terms of financial vulnerability, it's about in line with the UK, but the data's telling us that digital exclusion is actually higher than expected. So going back to those people that are more likely to be reliant on cash and face-to-face banking, these are the sorts of people, the people of Redcar, that are probably likely to be impacted more so by these branch closures. So if these people did want to use a branch that wasn't a Nationwide or a Halifax, the next nearest they've got is in a little place called Eston, 5 miles away, where there is a branch of Virgin Money. But actually, if you bank with one of the other brands, especially one of the big four, what you've got to do is probably do a round trip to Middlesbrough, which is going to take you an hour. That's not actually much good. If you're a small business, you need to do that every day. That's not really going to be meeting your needs very well.
So what we then do is test that data. So we go and do a site visit. We visit, there's 3 of my colleagues who will be driving on a motorway right now somewhere in the country to go and literally walk on the streets, count the shops, and figure out how much cash is actually here. Is the data pointing us in the right direction? And we do that when, as Jamie said, when Santander said it was closing its Redcar branch, we went and did that. And we did that before anyone knew that Redcar was closing, that the Santander branch was closing. And there's a little lesson in there, which is we built this data system across the industry and we sit centrally with it. And the banks trust us to use that data to come up with answers across the piece. So I think the data world that we've created builds that trust, but it also enables us to go, well, if Santander and Lloyds are both closing in one place at one time, we can know that. We can't tell Santander that the other one's closing and vice versa, but it gets us to a consumer outcome. And it's based on that trust of those firms that we've got a decent system speaking the same language. So we go on a site visit and the question we ask is cash good enough here once that branch closes? And in Redcar, the answer was quite simply no. There are enough shops, there are enough people, there is enough deprivation, there are enough cash users that we needed an additional service there. So we've recommended a shared banking hub to make sure there's enough cash on the ground. And the one thing I'd add about that assessment that we do is that we go beyond that circle. So Jamie rightly says we simplify everything down so we've all got talking the same language. But we go and test it and we go, well, who's coming in? What do they rely on in this village here? Are we getting the answer right? And I think we're also trying to do a sort of jigsaw puzzle. So having said I'm a bit of a laggard and that Link is the 80s fintech, in that earlier session with Sue, I got ChatGPT out, which was a bit daunting, to be honest. And I asked it to come up with a branch strategy for essentially banking hubs. As if we weren't Link, as if we'd started with a blank sheet of paper and said, let's go, let's put them in. The government have said they want 350 hubs. ChatGPT told me we need 250 and some mobile branches here and there. I'm not convinced that AI's got the right answer and will ever get the right answer with all the prompts I've got in, because we're not building this from scratch. We're not a retail proposition. We are a not-for-profit coordinating body filling in the gaps here and there. So having a dynamic picture of, is that branch in Eston still open? What's happening in Middlesbrough? Who lives here? Is really key to filling in those gaps and making sure it all works. So what impact have we had? I think for me, obviously, again, going back to Westminster, the government set a target of 95% of people living within a reasonable distance of access and deposit, so withdrawal and deposit of cash. We're currently at 96%. You cast your mind back to that slide I gave and that Jamie talked about the networks. That 96% is basically the same over the last 7 or 8 years. So the job we are doing to keep the geography actually seems to be working from the data we're looking at. There will be little bits of noise, there will be areas where it's not quite right, but keeping that level while the network slims down is a really good metric of the impact we're having. And Jamie's done some numbers on what's actually changed as well.
That's right. In terms of the banking hubs, they are providing access to branch for 1.6 million people that wouldn't have access to a branch otherwise. That's a massive population. And actually, when you look at those 1.6 million people, about 1 in 6 of those are actually within the sort of our most financially vulnerable or most digitally excluded categories, higher than the sort of 10% you'd expect on average. And that to me and to us really evidences that this is working, that those banking hubs really are targeting the people that are most in need.
And I think to that point at the bottom there, this shared view, this common language that we talked about a few times, I think looking forward, that is going to be increasingly important as well. So as we bring AI into this, as we get more challenge from people, as the network thins down even further, having that common language, having that data running through everything that everyone actually understands, I think is only going to get more important as time goes on. So what are we doing next? Jamie, you're talking about a measure of cash demand, which will be a step away from what we've done so far.
No, exactly. Yeah. So work doesn't stop. No rest for the wicked, as it were. So the next thing we're looking at is introducing this specific measure of cash demand. And we're doing that by leaning into some of CACI's individual level data, so our Ocean product, that models behaviours onto individual adults across the UK. Now that's telling us that 30% of people are heavy cash users, are cash users. And by rolling that out across our retail centres that we've decided, our 8,000 high streets, as it were, and then we're validating those numbers regionally against some of the data from Link themselves. So some of the ATM volumes, the transaction volumes they're seeing across the ATM networks across these areas, we're making sure everything tallies up. We're looking at bringing that into the data we're providing. And the other thing we're looking at is on a small business front as well. So we've worked with a couple of banks to understand the organisations that are sort of heavy cash users. So those are your pubs, your cafes, the hairdressers, some of those places I mentioned earlier. But it's also organisations, your clubs and societies, religious groups, charities. So we're using our points of interest data as well to gather information on those, count those up, and provide those as data points as well within our retail centre data. So there's a much more rounded picture, both from consumer and from small businesses, for the level of demand for cash in each location.
And we're also going to learn from the hubs. So we've recommended 226 hubs so far as of yesterday. There's about 150 of them operating, and we're getting an actual live view of who's using them, what groups are using them, how busy are they, and we can pin that back to all the decisions we've made and go, is our model as good as it could be? Are there better decisions? Are we missing locations as well? So we'll be feeding that back in. And based on this conference today as well, I'm going to be talking to the team about how we can build in a bit of AI to really challenge us. I don't know how, and they're looking worried. So, because I think it's interesting, right? So, I guess some key takeaways, right? So we talked about this a fair bit, but for me, the main thing is that common language about data. So getting all those stakeholders together has meant that us, this little 80s fintech that did nothing to do with any of this stuff, have built this ecosystem where we are speaking the same language, we are taking a data-first approach, and it runs through everything. And that's where we've got to that real impact on financial inclusion that you can see on those high streets. And hopefully, for those of you who do use cash, you'll be able to carry on doing so for as long as needed, because we think it's really important. So thank you.